So Nancy Spannaus, we're so honored to have you here. She has the author of many books, but the book tonight will be called Defeating Slavery: Hamilton's American System Showed the Way. Could the United States have eliminated slavery without a civil war? In her 2023 book, Nancy Spannaus argues that the hope for doing so lay in adopting Alexander Hamilton's principles for industrialization. As she documents, the American Revolution had created the strongest anti-slavery movement in the world. But without breaking with British imperial economics, that movement was doomed to failure. Hamilton's American system offered the alternative, but was tragically sabotaged with the triumph of Jefferson and then President Jackson. Join Nancy to discuss this crucial background to the political turmoil we are still experiencing today. And a little bit about Nancy Spannaus. She is a public historian who has been studying American history with an emphasis on its economic development in general, and Alexander Hamilton in particular, since the 1970s. In 1977, she co-authored a book of writings on the political economy of the American Revolution. After retiring from a career in journalism, in 2019, she self-published the book Hamilton versus Wall Street: The Core Principles of the American System of Economics. And in 2023, she self-published Defeating Slavery: Hamilton's American System Showed the Way. In 2017, she established the blog AmericanSystemNow.com, which contains more than 600 articles on the history and principles of the American system of economics, including many original sources from advocates of that system, such as John Quincy Adams and Abraham Lincoln. Nancy is a graduate of Bryn Mawr College and Columbia University. She is a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society, and the Lincoln Group of DC. So with that, I will turn it over to Nancy as she tries to share her screen and give her presentation to us.
It worked
Nancy,
before.
I'll turn it over to you.
It worked before. We hope it works again. So what I want to do tonight is give you some highlights from this book, which I published in November of last year. I began it in 2021 when I felt that this issue of how we dealt with slavery in our history was becoming very hot and also very misrepresented in many cases. So this is by no means my full argument and case, but I hope to intrigue you sufficiently that you will be interested in reading the book and spreading the book and writing about the book on Amazon and whatever else you might be inspired to do. I did try to get this book published by University Press, and they were all very polite, but one of them said, well, we don't do big argument books. Well, this is a big argument book, which I think is very important at this time in our history. So, as I said, this is based on the book. You're not going to be able to read that little thing anyway. You can only read it in the big one, which features appropriately the Passaic Falls, the site of the Society for Useful Manufactures, in conjunction with the fight against slavery, because that's the core concept of the book. Now, the book's not organized this way, but these are the major theses which are supported in it. First, that we in America at the Revolution created a strong anti-slavery movement, the strongest in the world. The second, that to realize that abolition, it was necessary to break from the British economic system, which consigned us to supplying raw materials. Third, that Alexander Hamilton was the guy on the scene who put forward the economic principles and laid the basis for breaking with that system. And four, that it was the sabotage of that industrialization program called the American System of Economics, which effectively made the Civil War necessary to end the slave system. So there's an integral connection between the the end of slavery and the need to industrialize. So first, the first thesis takes up a fair amount of the book because, in fact, just as slavery has been underplayed in a lot of our history, so has the anti-slavery movement in the early United States, because it didn't begin in 1830, it began a lot earlier. If you've heard of anything about it, you know that the Quakers were prominent. They were actually a substantial portion of the population here. That agitation began as early as 1688, and it was centered heavily in Pennsylvania, but not only. This fellow actually supposedly looked like this, Benjamin Lay. He wrote major attacks on anybody who held a slave or dealt in slavery as an apostate to Christianity, and did a lot of wild things like spurting blood on people, and was kicked out of the Quakers, but had a major impact through his writings nonetheless. More important was this fellow Benezet, because he was at the center of actually creating an international movement across the Atlantic with people in Britain and France and Benjamin Franklin and others to oppose slavery. He set up schools for Black children, both enslaved and free. He did research. He interviewed ship captains of slave boats and exposed the horrors. He went and wrote about countries in Africa, such as Guinea, attacking the idea that they were also savage. It was really a benefit for slaves to be sent to the United States. And he established the first anti-slavery society anywhere in the world, as far as I can tell, in Pennsylvania in 1775. The first one established in Britain was in 1787. Now, it wasn't just the Quakers. The New England Congregationalists were also very much in the forefront of the anti-slavery movement. This is James Otis. You would know him from the Writs of Assistance fight in 1761, but he expanded that fight, as you may know, to asserting the natural rights of all Englishmen and how they should be extended to Americans. And he extended that to condemn the enslavement of Africans, saying there is no basis for discrimination on the basis of race, which was a real shock at the time when he did that. Samuel Adams, very prominent. Yes, you can see these are prominent leaders of the revolution, and they are on record and in activity. In the case of Sam Adams, he's introducing legislation into the general court in Massachusetts, calling for the banning of the slave trade, and in some cases calling for the end of slavery itself. And town meetings are supporting those resolutions. And him doing that, every one of them gets sabotaged by the royal governor. Of course, it's not only white voices, there are also significant Black voices. Most significant and publicized is Phyllis Wheatley, whom you probably know the case of. She was a cause célèbre for the enslaved and for those opposing slavery, and a real thorn in the side to those who insisted that Black people were inferior in their mental capacity. So more could be said about that, but she got a lot of publicity when she succeeded in convincing a jury of people at Harvard that she actually was the author of these poems. Then you have Samuel Hopkins of Rhode Island, another Congregationalist, and he went so far as to write a major pamphlet on the eve of the Second Continental Congress, demanding, when the representatives acted to go the next step in challenging the British clampdown, that they also abolish slavery. That didn't happen. but what he wrote and his argument was widely circulated throughout the colonies. What did come out of that Congress, as you know, is the Declaration of Independence. These days, its statement that all men are created equal is as controversial as it was back then, as to how people interpreted what that encompassed. I take the view that of Abraham Lincoln, that what was being done there was to declare the right of every person to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as a maxim toward which we strive as a country. Put it up there that this is where we have to go. That's our ideal. And I find it very interesting that a few decades later, Alexander Stephens, Vice President of the Confederacy, agreed that the founders did mean that all men were created equal, because as he said in this speech defending the Confederate Constitution, the founding fathers who held slaves believed it was wrong. They felt themselves economically so dependent on it they wouldn't kill it, but they thought it was morally wrong. He said, well, we in the Confederacy have finally established a government based on the true principle, which is that blacks are inferior. But I think that's good testimony to what was going on at the time. The Declaration inspired many people, not only in the white population, but also in the Black population, particularly free. Prince Hall, one of the examples up there in Massachusetts, but not only, using the Declaration to bring suits for liberty and demand that slavery be ended. And we had manumission societies begun. The New York Manumission Society formed in 1785. The second one that I know of, actually, after the one in 1775. That one in Pennsylvania that Benezet founded was a little dormant during the war. They had other things to do, but it was reestablished in the 80s. This one, founded in New York, was extremely significant nationally in the fact that it educated so many Black children who became leaders later on. It was headed by John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton was a prominent and active member. And then the states began legislative action. This is, nothing like this had happened around the rest of the world. First, you have Vermont, which isn't even a state yet, but it's acting like a state within New York, writes a constitution which outlaws slavery. Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and then other states begin to liberalize their manumission law. Interestingly enough, as I think was reported on maybe one of your conferences or another one, by a lady who did work on slavery at Mount Vernon, it was actually illegal for someone, a plantation owner in Virginia, to free their slaves until 1782, unless they went to the governor and got permission. So in addition to all the other obstacles that were put up, like having to post bond and all those kinds of things. But this was a very rapid movement toward freeing Blacks, and then freeing the enslaved. And by the time you hit 1800, the numbers had grown enormously of free Blacks, which is not to say they had a good situation, but that they were moving in that direction. And then you come to the Constitution. Well, what did the Constitution do on this? There were obviously compromises, but certain other things were done. that would point in the direction of getting rid of slavery, the banning of slavery in the territories, and giving the federal government power to do that, establishing a date for the abolition of the slave trade, refusing to recognize slavery or property in man. That was actually a vote against doing that in the Constitutional Convention, and giving the federal government those powers that could be used to end slavery. Southern leaders were very aware of this. Patrick Henry, said they want to free your blacks. Or he actually used a different word. It was and yet this is what was done. I give a lot of credit, and I think anyone who thinks differently about this has to give consideration to Frederick Douglass's view, because he was emphatic that despite the compromises, that the Constitution was an anti-slavery document, and that while slavery was recognized and sanctioned locally, freedom was the national norm. Now, the second point is that the British imperial system had to be replaced because it was a major support for the slave system. And that was true all the way up to the Civil War. First, you've got all the vetoing of the legislation that was carried out. The first one I know of was in 1712 in Pennsylvania. That was legislation to massively increase taxes on the slave trade that would have crippled it. And the Crown would consistently say, no, this is a big source of income for us. You can't do that. Then you've got Massachusetts, Virginia, and probably others, but I didn't put them there. Then you also have the economic establishment in Great Britain voicing not support for slavery outright, but opposition to the America becoming a manufacturing nation. This means effectively sabotaging an alternative to the slave system. Britain was the largest market for the slave product, for American cotton, and they were constantly putting pressure on the plantation owners to cheapen their cost, which would mean reducing their support for their slave labor. And the British played a major role, if not the major role, in financing the expansion of slavery to the West. I found a doctoral thesis that was written that showed that there were agents of British financial houses all throughout the South who would go to the plantation owners and say, we'll lend you money if you want to go west. Well, there's great land in Mississippi, there's great land in Alabama. You can take your slaves and make a lot of money. We'll give you the credit. So they played a major role in that respect. And on the manufacturing front, the British were consistently prepared and did carry out trade war to try to bankrupt any manufactured developments in the United States. This first happened after the Treaty of Paris in 1783. It happened again after the War of 1812. This is an example of a guy in the Parliament who is saying, look, it's well worth us sending stuff over at a loss in order to stifle in the cradle foreign manufacturers. Ironically, or not, I don't know how typical it was, but this guy Brougham is well known supposedly as a big anti-slavery guy, but what he is doing is supporting the slave system by trying, in the United States, by trying to destroy the manufacturing alternative to that. And that is consistent throughout the history, where the British are very proud that they don't have plantations on their islands, but they're totally happy to support it in their colonies or would-be colonies. So the third thesis here is probably the crux of the matter, and which is that Hamilton's principles of political economy that were to create an industrial nation were a potential alternative to break the slave system. Hamilton never said that explicitly, but I believe that it can be shown that that's the case. The core document from which those principles can be found is the Report on Manufactures. That's a major element in my first book, and that's where he extensively goes through not only the theoretical justification for why a nation that is going to be really independent has to have its own manufacturing base and not be dependent on exports, not have to have exports in order to survive, but also lays out exactly how that should be done and what the benefits of manufacturers would be. And that report, interestingly enough, begins with an attack on Adam Smith, not by name, but the argument which is laid out that he is attacking is that of Adam Smith. And, to put a little emphasis on his commitment to this, of course, we have the establishment of the Society for Useful Manufactures at basically the same time, which was a pilot project to show a multi-industrial agricultural center that might show how this was possible. They actually recruited people to come to the SUM by circulating the Report on Manufactures in the British Isles. Hamilton was known to be anti-slavery. This is one of his first statements to that effect, but back there in 1774 in his defense of the Continental Congress, his first major document. And there he connects the moral disasters, the fatality of slavery, with the fact that it also destroys industry. So being someone who is then tasked as Treasury Secretary to develop industry and create a functioning economy, he's going to be looking at alternatives to that kind of system. And he does elaborate effectively in the Report on Manufactures that progress depends upon increasing the productive powers of labor through mechanization. He's constantly talking about labor-saving devices, one might say, and technological progress, just the opposite of the policies which slavery depended on, which was basically brute force labor. And, he's clear, this is brief, but, indicative in my mind, that what will be developed through supporting manufacturers is an advancement of the human mind. And in fact, that it is it's the product of the human mind in terms of invention and technology that allows the wealth of the nation to be promoted. again, just the opposite of what the slave society does, which is to attempt to debase human minds and bodies to simple machines. Now, one section of the book in this area is devoted to refuting the idea that slavery was the basis of wealth in this country. And just there are two authors, interestingly, who present it as a real life experiment, the contrast between the industrializing North and the slave South, which, the difference in terms of the life circumstances and standard of living for the general population. Of course, in the South, the richest people were much richer than people in the North, but the plantation owners. But that was based upon them putting a price on their slave labor. Wasn't based upon any kind of standard of living for the population as a whole. So that's one element that actually makes it very clear. And it was clear to people as early as the 1790s visiting from Europe that places like Virginia were impoverished. The roads were almost impossible. The housing was terrible. It was just compared to New England and Pennsylvania towns, it was a disaster. Real wealth, as is supported by Hamilton, depends upon infrastructure. It depends on a workforce that thinks, education, the power to produce efficiently. And that is what's precisely prevented in a slave economy. And many Southerners realized that. This guy, Hinton Helper, wrote a major documented book with census data from the 1850s demonstrating how the slave system had prevented the South from having manufacturing, from having schools, from having railroads, and he blamed the slave oligarchy, his term. Not the North, not as many people would, or you could even blame financiers in the North for part of that, but he blamed the slave system and demanded that that actually be ended. But that didn't happen. The person who was this guy, Henry C. Carey, was Lincoln's one of Lincoln's chief economists, and he began and a Hamiltonian, and he began in the 1850s to write about how industrialization could end the slave system. He wrote a major book in 1853 and worked on programs that he provided to the Lincoln administration. This is what Hamilton never did, but using his principles, he laid that out. Industrialization could lead to the end of the slave system by raising the value of labor, by increasing population density, by creating towns, education, and so forth. And his view was that if we had adopted a system of industrialization early on, he says, had we had legislation that would affect the Declaration of Independence. In other words, if we had an economy that was consonant with the Declaration of Independence, we would by now have, the South would have been filled with furnaces and factories as well as agriculture. The laborers would be free people, white and black, and we would have been actually economically free from Great Britain, whom he accused of working to bring about a separation of our country. So the last section, the sabotage. Hamilton was not able to do a whole lot toward actually moving to end slavery. But some of the initial infrastructure for industrialization was established under his regime. And in fact, stabilizing the credit system, creating a source of credit in the national bank, things that Dick Silla has laid out as his financial revolution. But beginning with the Jefferson administration, all those aspects were under attack, where he sought to kill the national bank, end federal support for infrastructure, reduce taxes to a perilous level, and discourage manufactures. And one thing he did, which I find, Nicole may have mentioned this before when she talked about the Haiti, but one of the first things Jefferson also did was cut off commercial relations with Toussaint Louverture, who was a Haitian revolutionary who wanted to establish a workable government. He didn't want to exterminate all whites. He wanted to keep the whites there. He wanted to create a functioning economy, stable government, and Jefferson cut that off because that was not his predilection. He, of course, also presided over the massive expansion of slavery through the Louisiana Purchase. The slavery already existed in that purchase, of course, through France and Spain. Interestingly, the Congress, when they approved the purchase, not only banned there being international slave trade into Louisiana, but also domestic trade into Louisiana. That would have prevented the migration of the slave system into places west of the Mississippi there. But that was reversed a year later with the approval or encouragement of Jefferson, who said that his policy for ending slavery was to diffuse it throughout the country so people wouldn't feel a threat, there wouldn't be concentrations of slaves, and they ultimately would free them, which I think is insane. So Jefferson's attacks on the Hamilton's policies resulted in the closing of the National Bank. The U.S. barely survived the War of 1812. See here, fortunately, the British thought Napoleon was the bigger threat, so we got away. But after the war, Hamilton's vision came back, particularly through Matthew Carey, and he began to reprint sections of the Report on Manufactures. He set up organizations to encourage manufactures, canals, and other infrastructure that was necessary. Industry is the only sure foundation of national happiness, greatness, in its useful form. And under John Quincy Adams, this policy began to take off. The Army Corps of Engineers got the okay to begin to map out a canal structure for the country, and then railroads, tariffs, supported industry, and we began to make some progress, which was immediately countered by the creation of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party, as you may or may not know, was an alliance of New York politicians connected to the financial center there, and an organization representing the slave owners of Virginia, the Richmond Junto, And they created this alliance, which in 1828 formally formed the Democratic Party. And their standard bearer, of course, Andrew Jackson. Why Andrew Jackson? Well, he was a military hero. How are you going to get people to mobilize against what allegedly was a plutocratic program of economic development, even though what was going on was very broadly circulating and not simply within the major cities. There were canals being built throughout Ohio. There's throughout the rest of the states, industries established and so forth. And one of the key instruments of that was the Second National Bank, which had been established after the War of 1812. But so the major target that was established was the Second Bank of the United States. And Jackson mobilized his populist base to target and kill that Second Bank of the United States, which was required as a source of credit to support infrastructure development and the industrial development and commerce, and was acknowledged as such. There was a mass of memorials sent to Congress complaining about his action to kill the Second Bank when he pulled the money out. But that was ignored, and he went ahead. And according to Henry Carey and John Quincy Adams, that was the turning point toward an expansion of the pro-slavery feeling in the country, and toward cutting off the move toward us becoming an independent manufacturing nation. That's when cotton really takes off, and we begin to go even more rapidly into two economies, one in the South, one in the North, and the end result is civil war, as John Quincy Adams explicitly actually predicts when Jackson succeeds in destroying the bank. I conclude this book with a very short chapter, not with any solutions, but with my encouragement that of why this is important, that we have to get our history straight. People are confused now. We always had a fight against slavery, and people need to know that. Get the economics straight, have people understand that that you can't have a decent standard of living and prosperity without the kind of economic industrialization that Hamilton was proposing. And in terms of the longstanding cultural problem and animosities that we have, the only solution I see is to restore a common purpose, that being up for grabs. And then this is for more background. This is how my blog, the books, and my email, because I am open for questions and dialogue anytime. And that's it, folks.
Amazing. Thank you, Nancy. It's really, I mean, it's one thing for us to have the presence of an author, but for you to put together this incredible presentation, and I think give everyone such a good introduction to your book and all the different ideas and research that it has in it. So I really hope that this encourages everyone to go out and grab a copy and dive a little bit deeper into what Nancy has shared tonight. And I do ask that everyone let us know your questions in the chat. Now is your chance, whatever you'd like to ask Nancy, either about her presentation or about her book, some of the things that Nancy has shared tonight. And while you all start putting your questions in the chat, Nancy, I would love to start it off and just learn a bit more about the background of what drew you to write this book in the first place.
Well, the certain things were happening in 2019 to 2020, which which really spurred me. I mean, I have had a longstanding interest in the civil rights movement. My husband was very active in it, and so forth and so on. But the so the idea of, and also, I mean, even in Dick Silla's major book, he says, you know, the one economist that might have had allowed us to end slavery without a civil war was Hamilton. You know, so it's not like it was a brand new, you know, idea, but in general, people hadn't put together the economics and the anti-slavery movement, which now there's more on that early period. I was surprised to find that. But the things that sort of galled me, you know, because I tend to respond to that. 1619 Project saying we were founded in 1619. You'll find stuff in the book on that because, you know, we weren't. And number two, the murder of George Floyd, which really exposed, you know, our continuing problem with the legacies of slavery. And the third was the attacks on Hamilton as a slave owner, which your father, you know, encouraged me greatly. And Michael Newton, you know, backed up in a tremendous way. I had to do battle on that last week. You know, the first time I've had a presentation where somebody said, what about, you know, how do you do this when Hamilton was an enslaver? And I had to say, well, you know, I've got what, go to this website, you know, and that's I didn't, and because I don't think it's true. So those three things sort of goaded me, and the more I got into it, the more I did on the depth of the anti-slavery movement, which there's a 700-page book that came out in 2016 by Manisha Sinha on that movement. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of that we just, I mean, people have no idea what was actually going on. It's our history is so surface that it's unfortunate.
Well, that's very powerful. Thank you for sharing some of the background of what inspired you. We do have a question here. Well, commentary and question about Andrew Jackson and some of what you were sharing in your presentation. What was Andrew thinking? That might have been a rhetorical question.
What was Andrew
Also,
thinking?
Andrew Jackson, but also just a question about, was Alexander Hamilton's son working from Andrew Jackson? I don't know if you have a lot of background on that. I'm happy to add to whatever you
You
have
can
to
fill
share
in.
about
I
that.
know he was, and I remember Jackson saying something to him, you know, your father was against the bank or something like that. I mean, some ridiculous thing. I don't think Andrew Jackson was a scholar, but of any sort. But
Yeah, so yeah, James Hamilton, he did serve as the acting Secretary of State for Jackson and actually was very close socially with Jackson. And even when he was no longer acting Secretary of State, apparently Andrew Jackson did turn to him for, in general, uh, advisement and different things throughout his presidency. And I believe that he also appointed him a pretty prestigious district attorney role in Florida, if I recall correctly. But he did he did tell according to James Hamilton's reminiscences later on that well, your father was against the bank, not realizing apparently that Alexander Hamilton founded the bank and was a strong proponent of the necessity for a national bank for the nation to prosper. And
Right.
uh, and actually, that sort of ties into another question that I had for you regarding Matthew Carey and how he was really shared Hamilton's report on manufacturers. And I'm curious if you got a sense in your research that it became, that Hamilton's report not really well known and well circulated during his time, and that Matthew Carey, through his promulgation of Hamilton's report, do you think that helped it live on a little bit more, at
Oh, yeah,
least in
I
those
think
circles?
absolutely it did. Well, of course, the first thing he did, I believe he was the first one to publish it publicly in his journal, the American Museum, which he had right around the time of the 1790s, like I think it was only 4 or 5 years, but it was right in that cusp around the 1790s. And he did publish it at that point. So, but that wasn't a mass, I mean, we didn't have mass circulation publications at that time. But, it would have circulated, but not among various elites, but it would not have been otherwise. Um, but definitely, Carey was an inveterate publicist, and he wrote numerous pamphlets. I mean, his pamphlet on the that he did first right after the War of 1812, called the Olive Branch, which was intended to um, say a pox on both your houses, really. You know, the Federalists at that point were not Hamiltonians, right? They were trying to break up the country, and many of them supported the British. So he attacked them, but then he attacked the Democratic Republican, the Jeffersonians, and said, "You screwed up. You bankrupted our defense, right? So we had no defense, and you also killed the bank." Now, I don't recall that he specifically praised Hamilton with it, but the first thing he did, actually, the first document he wrote in favor of the bank was before it was canceled in
Mm,
1811. He took a trip to D.C. along with Nicholas Biddle to lobby against the killing of the charter. And he wrote a long paper called, it's a ridiculous name, desultory comments on the blah, blah, blah. I don't know. So he was constantly writing. He ran a publishing house. He published books
mhm,
and so forth.
mm,
So in Pennsylvania, for sure, there was a lot. He was located in Philadelphia. There was a lot of circulation of his
mm,
stuff. And he that definitely played a role. And it goes, there's a direct line from Matthew Carey to his son Henry Carey to Lincoln, in terms of Hamiltonian policies.
And there's a comment here from Bruce where, ironically, the industrialization of the northern states helped the Union defeat the Confederacy. If you wanted to comment on that.
Yes, well, yes, indeed. Apparently, some people in wiser heads in the South. I mean, the South had some factories, obviously, and there was, and they had slave labor, but it was not en masse because so many of the plantation owners realized that when they sent these slaves to factories, they began to get uppity. They wanted to have more freedom, and they saw what else was going on, and they just, were harder to control and so forth. So it didn't really take off. But the what was I going to say? Um, but around the 1850s, as it became clearer and clearer there was going to be a confrontation, there was more discussion in the South of, well, we really have to have some railroads. Well, we really
Mm,
have to have, you know, build up some industry so we're not dependent on the North. But it just didn't take off. I mean, it's because the class that was politically powerful and running the slave operations was not the major ones, was not interested in taxing themselves to provide for this kind of expansion. And so it didn't happen.
mhm. Well, and it's interesting that you talk about, the enslaved individuals going perhaps offsite to a factory of some sort. But I'm sure, for instance, I know Jefferson
He
did
had
have a
factories
manufacturing.
on his own property. Yeah.
Right. So it was, and I think in that case, it was acceptable to have manufacturing because it was in the controlled environment of the plantation. But I'm sure it brought up a lot of power dynamics as you're having these offsite locations. I recall in a presentation, and I wish I remembered who it was. It might have been Dixilla, where he shared a really fascinating quote from Southern um, members of, they were congressional representatives, and they talked. Unfortunately, I don't remember it fully off my head. If anyone knows what I'm talking about, but they said specifically about how Hamilton's plans will lead to the end of slavery. And this was around the time that Hamilton was putting all these plans in place. So it was just interesting that there was this contemporary source of dialogue between Southern congressional leaders talking about Hamilton's plan and its relation to slavery.
Oh,
So
I
if I can
don't.
find that for you,
Gosh,
I know that would,
if Dick said that and it didn't tell me, I've got to beat him up. I don't
then
know.
it could have been, it was,
I
I
mean,
just was curious.
the presentation you had that actually discussed this directly was by Bob Wright, as I recall.
Mm,
Because I wrote
mm-hmm,
that up for the blog. He
mm-hmm,
specifically, but he had a totally different angle on it. I mean,
mm-hmm.
in terms of the cost of slavery to an economy.
Right. A
Yeah,
different lens to view it. We
right.
have this comment from Eliza M. Fantastic presentation, Nancy. It's good to see you. I don't have a question at the moment, but I wanted to share my favorite Hamilton quote that is relevant to the topic. Quote, "The sacred rights of mankind are not to be rummaged for among old parchments or musty records. They are written, as with a sunbeam, in the whole volume of human nature, by the hand of the divinity itself, and can never be erased or obscured by mortal power." Beautiful
One of
quote.
my favorites too.
Absolutely. Diana Conco had a question about whether, can you elucidate a little bit about whether Hamilton proposed for Blacks to work in with mechanical technological industry?
I don't have a direct connection with that. It, I don't have an example, right? But I do know that he didn't believe that blacks were inferior and incapable of that. That I know, but I don't know. I don't know, for example, the as at the SUM, right?
Mm-hmm,
Whether there was that kind of employment. I mean, he wasn't
mm-hmm,
directly in charge of that, of course. It was entrepreneurs who were given a place to set up. So
mm-hmm.
whether they did it or not, you wouldn't know. So I don't really know. Um, but well,
I think we can certainly look to his writings about how he proposed having a mixed economy to allow those to find their place, because for some people working on a farm might be their ideal working environment, for others not. And by having a diversity of
right,
options, and then
right.
also, there have been writings of his talking about how he viewed the expansion of the economy to help the African Americans to be able to have more of participation in the economy. So I don't know. I've never come across any quotes specifically about mechanical technological industry related to blacks, but certainly the spirit of what he talked
Well,
about.
certainly. Oh, actually, yes. The African Free School in New York. I mean,
Hmm.
they they had was teaching blacks not just reading, writing, and arithmetic, but particularly the male, the boys were,
Hmm.
many of them were, in order to, their best opportunity for advancement and to get out from under was to go to sea, right, and become work on ships. And so they actually taught astronomy or things related to practical, maybe practical astronomy. Yeah,
Vocational
uh,
training.
but more academic,
Advanced.
right, than
Hmm.
you would think of in a school today. I think if how to read the stars, right? I mean, what which so in that regard, for sure,
Mm.
as a sponsor of as a leader of the Manumission Society, which established the school, and supporter of the school, yes, indeed, I would say he would promote some technological education for this
Vacation was a big
enslaved or
deal on
former
ships back
enslaved.
then.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point.
What?
Oh, I just got some interference, but I was just agreeing that that's a good addition to,
Oh,
of
oh,
something
okay.
concrete to share. We do have a comment here from Helena Reynolds thanking you for your presentation and that she had originally heard about your book from Marianne Hamilton, widow of a Hamilton descendant. For those of you who may not know, Marianne Hamilton passed away on August 29th at the age of 90. And there will be a Memories of Marianne Zoom tribute this Sunday. For those that might like to know more, they can contact Helena and Greg directly about that. And Faye B had a question for you. Thank you for your book in bringing to life the history within my midst as a resident of Weehawken, New Jersey, and I visited the Passaic Falls, which should be significantly restored. My question, in your book, the chapter entitled Hamilton's Economic Pathway to Ending Slavery, you detail Hamilton stating that his support of manufacturing was in conjunction with the agricultural society and that the two forms of economy would make the nation stronger. What support do you have for the thesis that Hamilton intended the end of slavery with the manufacturing emphasis versus to be complementary with the agricultural society?
Well, agricultural society doesn't mean plantation society. It means, that we had an awful lot more small farmers throughout the West and throughout elsewhere. Um, my view that he didn't intend to save, the slave economy is based on what on my view that this that industrialization alongside uh, manufacturing um, would ultimately, if it extended to the South, right, would ultimately undermine and result in the end of the slave system, because it's incompatible. The necessities for successful total economy are incompatible with the requirements of the slave economy. And Hamilton was interested also in us being self-sufficient in our own necessities of life. So he wouldn't want to have had this huge export dependence on this huge export industry uh, based on slave labor. So you just have to read the book to get more of my argument. and you may not agree, but I think it's worth going into the detail.
Absolutely. Eliza M says, I also want to add that I appreciate your work here because with this book, because it's so important. It seems like so many of my generation, so many of my peers, write off founders like Hamilton and the other early abolitionists and claim them to all be problematic. But without Hamilton and his economic system and the work and efforts of those abolitionists, where would we be today? I appreciate you and the AHA Society for looking at the full picture. Thank you, Liza.
Yeah, well, that you agree with Frederick Douglass there. He specifically said, the activity in the 1830s, well, it actually kept building. In the 1820s was the beginning of the first Black newspapers, or the first papers devoted first to emancipation, then Black newspapers, then, increasing legal action and pressure on Washington, D.C. and so forth. The fact that something is not successful doesn't mean there wasn't a movement to end it. And what Frederick Douglass said was that it was very important that the educational role that the abolition societies played in the earlier period, because they equipped people who then were able to take more what you might call radical action in the later time.
Well, and I think a lot of the smaller, which aren't really that smaller efforts and changes slip out of the mainstream historical record. But if we look at, for example, under Hamilton's tenure as overseeing the Treasury Department, there was a law that was passed that made it illegal to import slaves from abroad on a U.S. owned vessel. So while they were grappling with trying to, it's so much more well known, the later laws that were passed that prohibited it completely, but this was an even earlier law. And so not only was this law enacted, but it was Hamilton through the Revenue Cutter Service, which we today know as the U.S. Coast Guard, that was tasked with overseeing that. So here, this service that he created and then oversaw the the carrying out the protection of this law from this occurring. There's a statistic that says that over 500 ships between the passing of this law in 1794 and the Civil War in 1865, there were over 500 ships that were captured by the Coast Guard, and every person on that ship that were brought in through this means were brought in and made freed. They were not enslaved. So when you multiply that, even though it was on a national scale, and there were still steps to be moved forward, same with the New York law for manumitting in New York City. Even as the dial was moved, it's important to recognize that in an unpopular time, they were able to move the needle to be able to get to a point where it could be eradicated.
Yeah, I have that legislation, and I think it's 1794 was passed.
Yes,
there, and of course the states were doing it. Were passing laws also. The northern states were passing laws because it was going in that direction. So
absolutely. And for those that would like to explore a little bit, at the beginning of the Q&A session, Nancy mentioned about the publications referring to Hamilton as being an enslaver. There's been some really poignant research exploring that further. Michael Newton here in the chat shares a link to the essay that he co-authored on whether Hamilton was an enslaver. It really dives deep into the research on that. And so you can find that at discoveringhamilton.com. Was Alexander Hamilton really an enslaver? You can also find links to the latest research on the ahasociety.org. So we do encourage you to keep exploring this topic. There's as Nancy has seen, there's so many different avenues and lenses with which this topic can be explored and, of course, should be explored. And you've received so many compliments here on your presentation, Nancy, and I would just like to close tonight by asking you if what do you most hope readers to take away from reading your book? If they could only take one message away, what do you hope that is?
One message. I don't know that I think it's that to achieve a moral end, you need to have the right economy. That it, to me, that is not that economy is everything. It's not, the longer slavery existed and expanded in this country, the greater the cultural problems became the political problems. It wasn't going to be a simple matter of, shifting or even of just banning slavery. I mean, Henry Carey attacked the British for the way they ended slavery in the Caribbean. He said they just left these people worse off than they were before. They had no industry, they had no support. They were just, dumped on the, wayside and said, okay, now you're free. Now what are you going to do?
Mhm.
So I think it's that people have to explore the principles of economy that are necessary for human freedom.
Wonderful. Well, that's a really powerful message to end on. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Nancy, for
Thank
your
you all for coming. Thank you all for
wonderful presentation. I
Thank
hope you
you.
will not only check out Nancy's book, but also visit her blog, americansystemnow.com. Please
It's
come join
free. The
us.
blog is free.
Exactly. And so many wonderful articles of all varying topics. So I do encourage you to visit there. And then also please keep in touch with us, theahasociety.org. We would love your support, your contributions, and we do hope that you join us on October 19th for our October book session. And we'll be sharing some more upcoming events in the coming months on our website. So please stay connected. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Have a wonderful evening.